Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and it's that spooky time of year where I'm going to be taking a look at some horror-themed games. And I figured that the first one we're going to be taking a look at here is a survival horror on the PS1, and that happens to be Galerians. So this game was developed by Polygon Magic and published by Crave Entertainment. And this game came out in all regions in the year 2000, although Japan got it first in 1999. Now, before we talk about the game, the one thing I do want to mention, just for the shit of it, is that the dude on the front cover looks a lot like Yuri from Shadow Hearts. In fact, that was the first thing that came to my mind when I first heard about this game. But within the in-game graphics, he looks a lot like Johnny Garland from Shadow Hearts 3, which is basically the all-out ridiculous one. As strange as it is, I have seen much more weirder shit than this, so anyways, now let's start talking about the game's story. So the character you play as is named Rion, which ironically enough also rhymes with Leon. I wonder what game they took that from. So with all ridiculous shit aside, Rion is 14 years old and he ends up waking up inside a facility. And the first thing he hears as soon as he gets up is a voice inside his head called Lilia. And just like good old-fashioned storytelling, of course, he has to have amnesia. So he does not remember this Lilia chick, and he also doesn't remember anything of where he is or what he's doing. But prior to waking up, there was a lot of doctors that used him as a test subject. So the reason why they're doing a lot of test subjects has to do with the fact that he has psychic powers. And there's a big whole conspiracy going around that has to do with his parents and what they were involved with, and of course with the whole facility. So that's the story on how this one pretty much starts out, but I do want to touch base on a couple other things about it. So the first thing I want to mention is the game's setting, is that this one is actually really different for a survival horror. Because this game's setting is a cyberpunk setting, which is not only something that you don't see very often within this genre, but it's actually pretty badass in general. The only game I can think of off the top of my head that plays similar to this would be Fear Effect, but of course that game is not a horror game. Now, one thing to mention within this game that did take me a bit by surprise is that there was a lot of religious references throughout this game. Now, I'm not going to get too much into why there is, since this is kind of spoiler stuff, and I know the game is old and therefore it shouldn't really matter if you know the ending or not, but the thing is, this is not like a popular game that like everybody was talking about. This is a pretty obscure game that got long and forgotten. So yes, we all know the ending to things like Star Wars and Final Fantasy, since, you know, those get like talked about like all the frickin' time. But I always try not to give them away if it's for a game that, you know, didn't get a lot of coverage or ones that may have been forgotten over time. So anyways, let's get moving on and start talking about the gameplay. So if you've played games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or even Alone in the Dark, it's very similar to that. So it's an adventure game with tank controls where you gotta walk around, collect items, find keys to open up secret doors, picking up random notes to tell backstories, and even picking up consumable items. You know, good old typical survival horror. But the one thing that makes this game pretty different is the combat. So in this game, you don't use any guns, you don't pick up bullets or anything like that. Instead, you fight enemies by using your psychic powers. In fact, it sort of reminds me of Stephen King's Firestarter, which is pretty interesting. Wonder if they're inspired by that. So how it works is that if you hold R1 and then press the X button, you can actually fire out a psychic beam. And there's 3 different types of powers that you can get. Like, there is a shockwave power, which is called Nalcon. Then there's red, which is napalm. And then finally there is a Dephalon, which is anti-gravity. So you find these capsules that have these elements within them, and then you inject them into yourself, and then that's how you pretty much reload your gun sort of thing. Or shall I say a psychic gun. And the one thing that also makes this game a lot different compared to other survival horrors is that you have an AP meter. And this does not mean action points, it means anger points. So the AP meter will gradually gain, and once it reaches maximum and you press R1, then you get to go into like Berserk Mode. And while you're in Berserk Mode, whenever you get close to something, it pretty much implodes on them. It's pretty awesome. In fact, I actually love the sound effects it makes whenever you kill someone this way. What an amazing sound to listen to while you're just like blowing up everyone's brains. But as awesome as the Berserk mode is, there is some drawbacks to it. So the first drawback is that you can't run within this mode, you have to be walking very slow. And the biggest drawback is that it gradually decreases your HP non-stop, and the only way to get out of Berserk mode is if you use a blue pill called a Delmentor, which gains it all the way back down. So you gotta be real cautious whenever you're in a tight situation, since sometimes being in Berserk mode could screw you over, especially if you don't have any of those blue pills. And there's one other pill you can get called a skip, where for a short period of time it will gain the level of your charge, because your charge, it starts out as level 1 and then it goes to level 2 and then level 3, and obviously at level 3 it charges like super fast and it does a much more powerful psychic attack. So I'd say it's best using those when you're at like a boss fight or a really tough enemy. So other than that, there's not a whole lot else I can explain about the game, since, like I said, this game is very similar to other survival horrors where, you know, it has like the pre-rendered backgrounds, the tank controls, the inventory management, picking random shit up, and of course, the game's puzzles. So now let's move on to the other things like the game's controls. And I think they're pretty good for what they are. So like I already said, the game has tank controls, which I know is not everyone's favorite thing ever, but I think they work good for this style of game, since I'd rather play a survival horror with tank controls than a platformer with tank controls. That's just fucked up shit. And the game's button layout is very easy to understand, so you have two different ways to run, so you can either hold L2 to run, or you can use the square button. X is for accepting and confirming things, the circle button is to show the map in the corner, triangle is used to scan certain objects, where sometimes if you scan a door you can actually see a certain clue about it. R1 is to charge your psychic power, and of course going into Berserk mode once your AP is full, and R2 is an option menu, which is a little questionable, but you know, it's not like the worst thing ever. And if there's multiple enemies in the room, switching targets is used by pressing L1. Figuring out how to move really should not be explained, but it is good to know that you can use the analog stick, which I do find to be very helpful. So the layout is all well and good, and of course they are very responsive, and like I said, tank controls can be a little bit sluggish, but I do think it does work well for this style of game. So now, let's get moving on to the other things, like the graphics. And I personally think this game still looks great for PS1. So I really love all the pre-rendered backgrounds. I think they all look really good, especially later on in the game. And of course, like I said earlier, the game has a cyberpunk setting, which I think is really awesome and badass. And it's very dark and gritty, but that's to be expected for a survival horror. And the game's character designs are also fairly nicely done, although one thing I'm sure some people have complained about is that some of the facial features on the characters are really weird looking, and yeah, you're right, they are very weird looking, but the way how I look at it is that they actually look kinda creepy looking sometimes, and you know what, that kinda adds more to the creepy factor of this game. And the game's monster designs are also fairly interesting, but probably my favorite looking monster would have to be these black shadow guys, which are called rabbits. Yeah, how the fuck does that look like a rabbit? Well, anyways, I think they look pretty fucking cool. In fact, they kind of remind me of the gray men that happened to appear in LSD Dream Emulator. So I really don't have any complaints at all about the graphics, and I think it looks great for a survival horror, especially one that came out in the year 2000. But one random fucked up thing I want to mention is that in Rion's bedroom, above his bed, he happens to sleep underneath a giant clown with a dick nose. I don't know who in the wagon wheels would actually want to sleep underneath something like that. So maybe that explains why he has psychic powers, because he just happens to be terrified all of his life. Well, anyways, with all that shit aside, the graphics in this one are awesome. So now, as for the game's music, as again, the music in this one is pretty freaking great. Now, within the first area of the game, you're not going to hear a whole lot of music. In fact, only like certain rooms will have certain bits of music or some like atmospheric stuff. But once you get to the second and third location of the game, then the music gets really good. So as usual, you get more atmospheric stuff and some music that does sound pretty creepy, but you also get a lot of really great tunes that do sound really good with the game and suit with the setting and all that kind of good stuff. Also, the game's opening theme song is pretty cool sounding too. So I really don't have any complaints about the music within this game. I didn't think there was any like real bad music within the game. Sure, there might be some tracks that are a little bit more on the forgettable side, but at least they do fit the game very well. And that I find is very important for a survival horror game, is to have good music. Because the usual classic survival horror games would not be the same thing if they didn't have the music that they had. And now, as for the game's voice acting, surprisingly, the voice acting in this game is actually pretty decent. Now, obviously, it's not perfect, and it's not like the most amazing thing you'll ever hear, but I think it was a lot better than what I was expecting. So the main character, Rion, is being played by Frank Newman, and I think he did do a pretty good job with this role. It's unfortunate that he didn't really do much else after this, but either way, at least he did a good job here. And then Lilia is being played by Julie Madalena. I think she did do a pretty decent job here. Obviously, it's not her best role ever, but I think it did work out pretty well. And then Ellen Stern plays two characters, and they happen to be Dorothy and Elisa, who happens to be Rion's mother. I think she did a pretty good job on both of these roles. And then the Birdman was being played by Michael Keaton. Nah, I'm just kidding, he was played by Kirk Bailey. He was pretty decent. It could have been a little bit better, but it definitely was not terrible. And then the character Reinhardt is being played by Derek Prince, and that's actually pretty awesome. In fact, he actually did do a pretty good job with this role. And then some random drug dealer guy is being played by Michael Sorge, which was kind of amusing. And finally, the last one I'm going to mention here is that Richard Epcar plays 3 characters within this game. Like, holy shit. And one of those characters happens to be Rion's father, Dr. Albert Steiner. Now, as good as he is, and even though he did suit all these roles really well, I do kind of wish that he did change his voice up just a little bit more on some of these characters, because they do sound the same. But thankfully, they don't all show up in the same room, so, you know, at least that's a good thing. But it is pretty cool to see one of my favorite voice actors within this game. So yeah, overall, for the entire cast, I think this is actually a pretty decent cast, especially for the time this was made. Like, goddamn, this is even better than the first Resident Evil's voice acting. But of course, that game still has its place for how cheesy it is. So now, if you want to go out and buy this game, it usually goes for about between $20 to $30, which I think is fairly good for a game like this. And I'm surprised it hasn't went up since then, since that seems to be happening a lot these days. And I happened to pick up a copy of this game a couple months ago for about $25, and I thought that was pretty worth it for that, considering that the game was complete and it all looked good and everything. And it's a game I just barely ever see. But just letting you know, it does have 3 discs, and I think it's mostly because of the amount of CGI cutscenes that it has. So yeah, this is one survival horror that is still sort of on the cheaper end, at least compared to games like Clock Tower. So now, as for my overall thoughts on this game, is that Galerians is actually a pretty sweet game. So I found the story was pretty cool. It may seem pretty typical stuff at first, but I think it gets really interesting later on after you escape the facility. The gameplay and puzzles within this game I thought were pretty good. But of course, the graphics and the music and the settings and all that kind of good stuff was just all out amazing. But with all that said, I'm not sure if I'd say this is like as good as like the classic stuff like Silent Hill or Resident Evil, although I did like it a lot better than Alone in the Dark. So if you've played the classic stuff like a bajillion times over and over again, this is one I would say is at least worth checking out, since the game does feel pretty familiar, but also a little bit different, especially when it comes to its concepts. And I ended up liking it a lot more than I was expecting. Now, one last thing to mention here is that there is actually a sequel to Galerians, and it's called Galerians Ash, and it's only on the PS2. Now, I haven't played this one yet, but I am very much looking forward to it, since I did like the first one quite a bit. And one other interesting thing to know is that there is actually a OVA series called Galerians Rion. As again, I have yet to experience seeing this show, but I do plan on seeing it and hopefully I can review it one of these days. So overall, Galerians is a survival horror that I liked quite a lot, and I think it is worth playing, not only if you're a survival horror fan, but also if you're a fan of cyberpunk setting. So that'll be the end of this horror-themed review, and there is going to be more throughout this month, so with that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.